cozy bookish podcast to listen to while you sip your morning cup of tea. I'm Hannah, a stay-at-home mom of two who loves to read and talk about books, and I'm so glad you're here. February is one of, if not my favorite month of the year. I love how short and sweet it is. It feels like a nice breather, a reprieve from the busyness of the holidays and getting back into a new routine in January. It's close to the beginning of the year, so you still feel like you have so much time left to accomplish everything you want to do, and you still have that motivation that comes with the new year. So I love February. This February has been particularly sunshiny and wonderful. It's been packed full of time with family and fitting in all sorts of crazy things. Despite all of that, I was able to read actually quite a lot. I was surprised when I looked back to see how much I read, because I felt like I was reading a few particular books for a long time, but I think at the end I was able to wrap up a bunch of books that I was reading along with everything else. I ended up reading 6 books this month, and I'm very excited to talk to you about all of them today. As always, I will be going through them in the order that I read them, so there's no real particular order. So with all that being said, enough preamble, let's get into the books. So the first book I read in February was One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. I mentioned this one at the end of my last wrap-up. I was reading it at the end of January, but I ended up wrapping it up at the beginning of February. This is a very hyped up book right now in the book sphere on social media. This is the first book in a duology known as the Shepherd King duology. So there are 2 books in this series and it wraps up from there. This is categorized as a romantasy book, so it is fantasy but with a romance plotline at the forefront. And this book actually really surprised me. I had this book on hold on Libby for a while. I just put it on hold because all of the hype I was hearing, and book hype does get to me. It's one of my weaknesses. If people are talking about a book a lot, I feel like I should read it to be part of the conversation so that I can form my own opinions on these things when I'm seeing it all over the place. So when everyone's putting this on their favorite books of the year list for 2024, I just put it on hold and didn't know if I would actually read it or not, but it came up as available, so I started reading it on my phone actually while I was rocking my baby. I like to have an ebook on my phone just as a backup in case I get stuck somewhere and just want to read a few pages of something. So this one was available at the time, so I picked it up and I immediately got pretty invested in the story. I was very surprised. These type of books are extremely hit or miss for me, like the really hyped up romantasy books. I don't like reading spice scenes. I find the characters in these books often are really annoying. The writing is often very juvenile and not my style. I totally understand why people enjoy these books. They're super easy to read and entertaining. I just always find them lacking. But this one I immediately got hooked into, which is extremely rare, and that momentum really carried all the way through the book. So let me talk a little bit more about what it's about. This fantasy world centers around a kingdom called Blunder, and within these kingdoms, magic is confined to these cards. I don't know if they're more like playing cards or tarot cards, but there are these different cards that each have a different magical ability tied to them. So like one card will give you beauty, another card will be like a truth serum, one card will let you read people's minds, etc. So that's the structured magic system. People get possession of these cards and then they can use them. They can harness the magic. But there's also this disease that's sweeping the kingdom that causes people to get magical abilities that they can't control very well. And in this world, magic always comes at a price. So the people who get magic from the disease will deteriorate eventually. a price will be paid to get that magic through this disease. So our main character, Elspeth, is one who has magic through this disease, but she must keep it hidden because people who are diseased are ostracized in this kingdom. So Elspeth has this great secret that she's keeping, this magical ability that is also rapidly taking control over her, and that she won't be able to hold back for much longer. And she teams up with a band of highwaymen and nobles who are working to reunite the full deck of magical cards. It is said that once these cards are reunited, that the curse of the disease will be lifted from the kingdom. So I really enjoyed the magic system in this book. I thought it was extremely interesting and well thought out. I also really liked the balance of the romance and the fantasy in this book. It really didn't feel like the romance was taking front and center. It really felt like it was well balanced in this book, for me at least, compared to other romantasy books I've read. I also didn't find the characters annoying or anything. They weren't anything particularly special, especially the side characters started to blur together in my head, but I enjoyed the journey. I was able to appreciate them for what they were, and I was able to root for them enough. I didn't particularly care for the romance part. I felt like it was pretty insta-lovey. The characters just fell into a romance incredibly easily without a lot of hurdles along the way until, of course, the very end with like the climax and the dramatic things that happened that led to, a cliffhanger to go into the next book. But even though it was insta-lovey, it didn't distract from any of the rest of the story. It was still fun enough to read about. There was a small open door spice scene that can easily be skipped. It's just a few pages, but it is there if that's something that you wouldn't want to read, or if you're thinking about passing on this book to a younger reader, just something to keep in mind. I also really enjoyed the writing. There are some fun poems that the author wove in to coincide with each card. So each card has its own poem, and it describes the abilities that each card possesses, as well as the price for using each card. So I thought that was a fun way to introduce the magic system in this book, and overall the writing was just really fun. It felt like I was reading an old classic young adult book when I was in like middle school or early high school, like The Hunger Games or Divergent or Cassandra Clare books, where the writing is just so propulsive and gripping. Even though this isn't strictly a young adult book, I would categorize this more as like an adult fantasy book, maybe more of like a transitionary book from the young adult section to the adult section, but it had that young adult feel where it's just very easy to read, very fast-paced and gripping. I really enjoyed this book. It surprised me all the way through, and I really liked the ending. I am actually currently reading the second book. I am trying to keep to my goal of reading through series quicker, so I am reading the second one right now, so I will be able to talk about that one as well as the duology as a whole next month. But yeah, I really enjoyed this one and would recommend it for anyone who might find it interesting to them. I ended up giving it a solid 4 stars, and that is One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. So one of my favorite booktube creators right now is Carolyn Marie Reads. I will link her channel in the show notes, but she hosts a book club on Fable called the Well Read Book Club, and I've sort of been passively involved in the book club. I haven't been able to read any of the picks so far since she launched it in November, because they've been books that I've already read and didn't really want to reread, or books that I couldn't get a hold of in time to read it. But this past month, for February, they read Hamlet by Shakespeare, and so I decided to just pick it up since, it's in the public domain. It's not hard to get at all. Shakespeare is relatively short and quick to read despite the difficult language to decipher. So I read Hamlet. I have not read Hamlet before. I've read many Shakespeare plays. I've read a few for a class. I was in A Midsummer Night's Dream as a production for my senior year of high school, but Hamlet is one I had yet to read until now. All I knew about it before going in is that it is very similar to The Lion King. I see people compare it to Hamlet all the time, so that's about all I knew. And I would say that is a fairly accurate summary of Hamlet. Just to summarize, this is a play by Shakespeare. Of course, it's one of his most famous plays, about a young prince in Denmark. He is visited by his father's ghost after he passes away, and he is told by his ghost father that he was murdered by his uncle, who has now taken the throne and married the queen. So throughout this play, Hamlet is going on this journey of mental anguish and trying to decide what he is supposed to do with this information, how he should take revenge for his father against his uncle. I will say it has been a long time since I've actually sat down and read a Shakespeare play, so just getting used to the language was a lot at first, and I found myself having to look up things as I was reading it to make sure I was understanding it correctly, which I think is totally fine. I don't mind doing that when I'm reading classics because I want to get the most out of it, but I must say I don't really understand the hype around Hamlet as one of Shakespeare's best plays. I ended up giving it 3 stars just because I totally respect it as a classic. I understand it's Shakespeare and therefore it is important in the literary canon, but I just didn't enjoy the story as much. I expected it to be more exciting, but it really is just Hamlet's inner turmoil throughout the whole book. I felt like there is interesting dynamics and conversations with other characters, with his mother, with his uncle, with Ophelia, and there's a fun play within a play motif, and the ending was very interesting as well, very exciting, but I didn't particularly find it very groundbreaking compared to other Shakespeare plays that I've read. So I will say I do wish I could read this more in a classroom setting to have someone who's smarter than me guide me through it and show me why it's so important. But for what it is and for my own experience with it, I just felt like it was a middle of the road sort of read, but it was quick and I am glad to get back into Shakespeare again. And those are my thoughts on Hamlet. Right, the next 2 books are kind of connected because it is Watership Down by Richard Adams and Watership Down, the graphic novel adapted by James Sturm and Joe Sutphin. Now, I won't go into detail about these books because I did a whole podcast episode on them. It is my whole detailed reread experience of Watership Down and my experience reading the graphic novel. Watership Down is one of my favorite books of all time. I love it so much, and in that episode I took you with me to hear my honest, authentic thoughts as I was reading it. All of my detailed, spoilery reflections are there. So if you want to hear my full review, you can listen to that full episode. But this is a classic book about rabbits who leave their home that is in danger to create a new community of rabbits. It is very reflective on the human experience. The characterizations are incredible. The descriptions are beautiful, and it's just overall an epic story that just has everything I love. It's so different than anything you will ever read. I can't recommend these enough. The graphic novel was also just excellently done. I love the illustrations. It did, of course, have to cut out some things and simplify other aspects of the book, so I would recommend picking up the actual novel first, since there is a lot of context that you would miss out on if you just read the graphic novel. But of course, I would just love it if anyone picks up this book in any formats, because I absolutely love this book and would love everyone to read and love it, but I know it probably is a very strange book to most people who would pick it up. But yeah, Watership Down by Richard Adams. Need I say more? I don't think I need to, so we can just move on. The next book I picked up was The Body in Question by Jill Climent. This is a super short book I picked up from the library and read it in just a few days. It's super fast-paced, book to just fly through. And I picked this book up because it is about a jury who is sequestered for a murder trial. And about a year ago, I actually served on a jury. It was one of the most stressful weeks of my life for lots of reasons, but overall it was a very interesting experience and one that has made me super interested in the experience of juries. I think it's such an interesting dynamic where you just get the most random people who would almost never meet in any other circumstance, and you put them all together and they have to work together to unanimously decide someone else's fate. Like, the whole idea behind it is incredibly fascinating and makes for such an interesting device to use in a book. I'm typically someone who doesn't really like courtroom dramas in books and movies, mostly because it's told typically from the lawyer's perspective or from the defendant or prosecutor's perspective. But I really like it from the jury's perspective, actually, because you don't get a lot of like the crazy jargon, like you're taking it in as a normal person would, a normal civilian who would be on a jury. And so that's really why I was drawn to this book and why I put it on my to be read list in the first place. I loved the trial scenes and just the deliberation process and everything. I thought that was so interesting and so well done in this book. But overall, the book did fall flat for me in the end because it really didn't feel like a courtroom murder mystery trial book. The trial was honestly maybe a third of the whole book. The whole murder mystery part was a very small part of this book, and when you consider how short this book is, like just about 150, 170 pages, that's really not a lot. And when you're making that the selling point of the book, it's kind of disappointing when it's not a lot. Really, this book is a character study of our main character. Throughout most of the book, we are only referring to the characters by their jury numbers, so I won't say their actual names, but our main character, she's in a very hard spot in life where she married a much older man and he is now rapidly deteriorating in health, and so she's dealing with being the caretaker for her husband, but also regretting a lot of the choices she made in life and wanting to sort of be free from this life that she's fallen into and escape through affairs and other salacious activities. And she's thrown in this jury and is sequestered and has to be away from her husband. So it really was just like a character study of her, and even the other jurors don't play a big role in the book. You would think there would be a lot of interpersonal drama between them and conflict when it comes to making the final verdict at the end, but really besides one other juror, there's really not a lot of interaction between our main character and the others. She kind of locks herself away from everyone else most of the time, honestly, and we're just left with her inner dialogue. There's also a shocking amount of graphic sexual content in this book, which I was not expecting. Like, literally the first day that they are sequestered, there's this whole affair that happens, and since it starts like right at the beginning of the book, I don't feel like that's fully a spoiler, but it just felt like very unbelievable to me that it would all happen that fast and be that graphic. So that was not particularly enjoyable to read, and overall the main character was not the greatest person to read from. And again, the trial part was just not a big part of the book, and in the end it turned out to be kind of anticlimactic. I was like really into the trial, and then there really wasn't any closure in the end. You kind of leave it where you don't really know if the jury made the right call or what exactly happened, and maybe that was done on purpose, but without any sort of closure or any other part of the story ending on a satisfactory note, it just did not work for me at all. I did love the writing. That's the one thing I do think was really well done in this book, was just the writing. I think Climent had just some really beautiful prose, even though our main character was not a great person. Just the way the author articulated the thoughts and feelings that she was having was just very interesting and very well done. So overall, I don't think I would recommend this book to most people, but I did give it a 2-star because there's like little flickers of things that I really enjoyed, and I got through it really fast. But I don't know if I would recommend it to most people. If you know of any other jury-centered courtroom drama books, I would be interested in checking them out, so let me know if you can think of any that would be better than this one. But that is The Body in Question by Climent. Right, the 6th and final book that I read this month was Don't Waste Your Life by John Piper. This is the Christian nonfiction book that I was reading this month along with my daily Bible reading, and I really liked this one. I think it was very solid, full of good truths and reminders. I've never read a John Piper book before, and I thought the way he articulated his thoughts was very well done, very thought-provoking and convicting. This book really pushes you to think about what are you living for, because it is so easy to just get caught up in the day-to-day, what we need to do, and we don't think about how to really give our life to Christ and what he calls us to do to further the kingdom and bring ourselves and others closer to God. What I really liked about this book was how balanced John Piper is about every angle of this topic of not wasting your life. There's the work that we are expected to do in the secular world and how that secular work is important and God calls us to work. But he also talks about our work for the kingdom, and a big section of this book was talking about having a war mentality, to always be on guard as if we're living through a war, which we are. We're living in a spiritual war all around us. And when you're living through a war, you live very differently than you would during a peace. I don't know if I'm explaining it in a good way. In World War II, even in the United States, people were growing their own gardens. People were resourceful. They were helping each other. They were sacrificing for the greater cause of the war that was bigger than themselves. And during peacetime, we are way more focused on our comforts and what makes us happy, and not really thinking about other people or being on guard for different threats that could come out of nowhere. Because in the grand scheme of things, our lives are incredibly, incredibly short, and the thought of wasting it, especially if you would call yourself a Christian from a young age, how are you going to use those years that you have to glorify God in everything you do and really evaluate what he has called you to do with that one life that he's given you? Again, I don't think I am explaining things particularly well about this book, but it's definitely one that's very deep, very heavy. It gives you a lot to think about and contemplate throughout the day. It's very short, but packed full of gospel-centered truth, which I really appreciated. And it's probably one that I will return to again at some point. Of course, I think, as I do with almost every Christian nonfiction book that I read, a lot of it goes over my head with my first read through, and upon reading it a second time and looking closer at the details around it, I think I'll get a lot more out of it. I gave this book about a 4.5 stars. Again, I just really enjoyed John Piper's writing and the way he explained things and tied it all back to scripture and the gospel, and I am definitely interested in reading more from John Piper in the future. So those are all the books I read this month. Again, I am honestly very surprised I was able to read that much with how much happened this month. I am very happy about that, and I'm excited about the books I'm bringing into March. Just for a little teaser into my next wrap-up, I am still reading through the biography on Bonhoeffer. I'm really hoping to finish it this month. I kind of put that one on the back burner for the later half of February because of everything else I was reading and wanting to finish, and that one was kind of slowing me down, so I'm hoping to pick that one back up and finish it this month. But again, I am also reading the sequel to One Dark Window, which is Two Twisted Crowns, so I will bring that one next month. And I'm also reading 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Super interesting. I have lots of thoughts on that one, so I'm excited to bring it to you next month. So those are all of my reading updates for February. I love just getting to sit down and talk about all the books that I read. It feels like I'm just talking on the phone or FaceTime with a friend about all these books that I had so much fun reading. Let me know what you have been reading in a comment on Spotify or YouTube or wherever. I would love to hear about it, and if you have any recommendations, as always, let me know. Thank you so much for listening and spending time with me today. You can connect with me and follow the show at Literary Morning on Instagram for all the latest news and updates. Show notes for this episode and more can be found at literarymorning.com. Did you love this episode? Be sure to leave a 5-star review or share it with a friend. Your love and support means the world. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you are listening, and I will talk to you again very, very soon.